Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Queering Reproductive Justice, a Book Talk. Now I'd like to introduce our Federal Policy Director, Alana Redfield, to get us started.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Alana Redfield. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Federal Policy Director at the Williams Institute. At Williams, our central mission is to ensure that facts and not myths and stereotypes are forming the basis of laws and policies that affect LGBTQ communities. I'm super excited to welcome you to this conversation today about queering reproductive justice. Um, as a bit of background, we are living in extraordinary times. In the world of policy, we often operate using a rights-based framework, so thinking about the protections the law can afford us. But in recent years, some of those protections have changed and to some degree eroded, or the sense of those protections for LGBT people and for reproductive rights. For example, we had the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court overturning the protections that were afforded under Roe v. Wade. We have now states rolling back abortion access, and I think at least 20 states have now banned or restricted abortion. 27 states have bans on gender affirming care for minors, and other states are enacting laws that protect access to abortion and gender affirming care. At the same time, we have, with the new administration, we have enormous cuts to Medicaid proposed in the budget under this Congress. We have a tax on HIV care, including the coverage mandate for PrEP. There's a case around that. There are cuts to funding for HIV-focused programs and services, both domestic and internationally. And we have executive orders from the president that redefine sex to exclude trans and non-binary people and intersex people, um, and a series of executive actions that target access to abortion and other reproductive freedoms. At Williams and at our partner organization, the Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy, we deeply believe that science, facts, and evidence are critical for policymaking, but those things are being undermined as well. For example, you may know of the Gender Affirming Care Report that was released on May 1st, which ignored the vast body of evidence that supports access to gender affirming care and came to some conclusions based on a much more limited body of evidence that aligned with the administration's ideological position on gender affirming care. Um, a side note to that, you may have heard also that in Utah, Republicans had commissioned a report. The legislature there had commissioned a report that took a scientific approach to gender affirming care for minors and actually came to the opposite conclusion. They came to the conclusion that gender affirming care is largely supported by the evidence. But of course, we see the impact in reproductive issues as well. So on the heels, we're also seeing HHS taking a similar approach to mifepristone, looking at putting out reports and evidence base that support their positions, and cutting funding for research, medical research, social science research, all the things that help us understand the real lived experiences of our communities. Now, there's amazing work being done to push back against the harms that might be caused by these policy changes. And in fact, our Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy is one important leader in the reproductive world. So we'll hear about that in a second. Um, but I think now many of us are also starting to think about the future in a different way. On the one hand, we can't ever go back to the way things used to be, or we probably can't. But on the other hand, maybe we don't want to. So now is the chance to envision what's next, what opportunities we can create, and what frameworks we might use. So I'm so excited to welcome Candace Bond-Theriault to talk about her new book, Queering Reproductive Justice: An Invitation. She's a mother, lawyer, author, speaker, social justice advocate who works at the intersections of law policy, reproductive health, rights, racial justice, LGBTQIA liberation, economic justice, and democracy reform. She currently serves with a different hat as adjunct professor at Howard University in DC and a senior policy director at Black Women's Health Imperative. Her book, her experience, her vision, her strategic thinking, we're hoping this conversation is the beginning of an opportunity to really start thinking about what is coming next. In conversation with Candace today, we have Melissa Goodman, executive director of the UCLA Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy. I've worked with Melissa for over a decade on policy initiatives spanning both coasts on repro and LGBT issues, dating back to her time in New York City Civil Liberties Union. Today, her and her amazing team work at these intersections of law and policy. So please check out their work online, and is just the perfect person to lead this conversation. So I'm really excited to hand this over to Melissa. But first, one last thing. We have a Q&A, so please use the Q&A in Zoom. So if you put questions in there, we're going to have time at the end for a couple questions. So please, as throughout the conversation, if you have things you want to ask, drop them in there and we'll take as many as we can at the end. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Alana. That was so kind and sweet. I appreciate you. And Candace, hi, welcome. I'm so excited to be in this conversation with you all. Just so folks know, I'm going to give just a few kind of opening thoughts and then we're going to dive right in. I'm really excited for this conversation because it truly brings together two of my lifelong favorite topics. One is how to better bring together the repro and LGBTQ movements. And the other is how do we build a clearer, more compelling vision for the world we actually want to build so that we have clearer things to rally around together and can better, frankly, plan how to get there, the steps how to get there. Both of these things are really hard. They take time and they don't come as naturally in our spaces as one would presume. So that was one of the reasons when Candace's book came out, I like ran to buy it immediately and am very excited about this conversation. I just want you to know we're going to hear, mostly from Candace, but I want you all to know kind of where I come from in this conversation. To sort of frame where some of my questions, come from. For me personally, I have always seen and experienced reproductive, sexual health, and LGBTQ issues as so linked and have always, frankly, sort of started from that presumption, but know that that's not true for a lot of people. I started in this work, really as a teen in HIV advocacy. And it was really because I had a number of family members, gay family members, but also some IV drug using straight family members who started dying of AIDS. And that sort of propelled me into pure sex education and activism work. Between that and frankly, growing up a pretty kind of confused bi kid in a very conservative rural upstate town, I feel like I naturally gravitated to both the LGBTQ and the repro and sexual health spaces, but they were sometimes or almost always very siloed. But to me, it felt like it was really all about the same thing. It was all about gender stereotypes and how society enforces them. And that's a view I still hold all these many, many years later. Eventually, I became a lawyer and also a parent, which has really profoundly shaped my views on all these things. For about 18 years before coming to the center, I was at the ACLU in various different capacities in different places across the country. It was very delightful to work with Alana for many, many years in New York. But I went to the ACLU because I wanted to be at a multi-issue organization. I wanted to be a reproductive, gender, and LGBTQ justice advocate, in a space where, folks were working across the board. I worked mostly on abortion and contraception access, trans rights, family building, and healthcare access. I worked on marriage equality a lot and also rights in the workplace, mostly in New York and California. But I wanted to do it in the context of a place that cared about immigrant rights, that cared about racism, that cared about economic justice and privacy and free expression across the board. And then eventually got to lead all the issue teams at the ACLU. And that really like forces you to do things intersectionally. You have to have some minimum of like organizational consistency and some kind of shared vision. So that was really a privilege to get to spend a lot of my career doing that. But a few years ago, I decided I really wanted to try something new and do something that allowed more space for strategic and intentional visioning and long-term thinking. So I came here to help build the Center on Reproductive Health Law and Policy. Very briefly, for those of you who are newer to us and don't know us, we are an independently funded think tank and research center developing long-term lasting solutions that advance all aspects of reproductive justice, and we address the current national crisis of abortion access. Our lawyers, our policy experts, our scholars, and researchers, we're a very interdisciplinary team. We're working to increase access to abortion and contraception, but also to end racial and economic disparities in maternal health outcomes, to support people who decide to build families, and also dismantle the gender bias that limits reproductive justice, and many other things, as we will talk about today. lastly, we generate and amplify new ideas, new scholarship, new research that's meant to be directly helpful to advocates in legal and policy battles today, but also for longer transformational change. We also do a lot of convening people across different disciplines and movements to really strategize and build new paths and new ideas. We do some last thing I'll say about the center, we do some work that's meant to more immediately or incrementally help advocates, policymakers, and patients. For example, in case this is helpful to any of you listening, we manage a pro bono legal network where we match healthcare providers or advocacy organizations or healthcare institutions with free quality legal services. We also provide technical assistance drafting bills, do analysis of impacts of legal developments, and much more. Our goal, and this is the last thing I will say before turning to Candace's brilliance, our goal is to be intersectional in a real way and to work in partnership, not just with our wonderful friends at the Williams Institute, but really to be a place that brings together sectors of our movements to think and build intersectionally and promote legal and policy ideas for the future that really drive progress not only for reproductive rights, but broader autonomy, equality, and actual access and resources that women, non-binary, and LGBTQ people need to thrive and be free at the end of the day. So that's where I'm grounded in this conversation. That was a lot. Thank you for listening to that. But I am going to turn it over to Candace. And Candace, who's written this brilliant book that I hope you all read, I want to start in sort of the most basic place, which is to hear what inspired you to write this book. What was your motivation? And I guess on top of that, I know that you started writing this book a very long time ago. I think you started to write it back in 2017. So I'd also love to hear, how does the fact that the US landscape sort of looks so different from when you started to write the book, how does that sort of impact how you think about the central vision of it?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you to the Williams Institute. So my book, with all of its many tabs, has definitely been
So
a labor
beautiful.
of love. And for me, I've always believed in the age-old adage, write what you know. So this is what I know. Write what you love, write what you're passionate about. The writing flows much easier when you really care about a subject matter and you're really passionate about it. And for me, this work was happening in real time. It's been happening for a long time. What exactly you were just saying around the intersectional work between the reproductive rights, health, and justice movement writ large and the LGBTQ liberation movement has been happening forever. There's a lot of folks who lead these movements who live at these intersections. And so for me, I just had to write it down. There's a power in naming and recording and making sure that there is a legacy, a memory of the work
Mm.
that is truly being done in the social justice landscape. So for me, it was also just this, I wanted to make sure people knew this amazing work that was happening already in federal spaces, in state spaces, in local spaces, and just kind of bring it all together. So it was really
Mm.
important for me to capture that movement and also to bring other people's voices and organizations into the work. So, it's not just my voice, my vision. A lot of it is, but a lot of it is also other organizations and other lawyers, other policy folks, other individuals who have been impacted by the issues in this book in different ways and have their voices really shine. Like for me, I am not an expert on gender affirming care, but Whitman Walker Health is. So I had a really intensive interview with them to really break down the policy concerns around gender affirming care because they are the experts. And so for me, this is a movement building book. And so I try to explain that through example of bringing in voices of folks who are most impacted and who really truly live these realities every single day. So it was just really important to me. And to get to your question about what's changed, what has not
Mm.
changed? What I
Very
think
little.
it would be really more interesting to say what has been the same since 2017, like the world, what is this world? What is going on? I think from every aspect, right? Like I think so much has changed and yet the bigger pieces remain the same. The bigger pieces of fighting for equality, fighting for justice, fighting for freedom, fighting for community have been the grounding principles of this book and continue to be the grounding principles of the queer and reproductive justice movement.
Mhm.
And so while so much has changed, I think the foundation still remains the same. And for me, it reminds me of how bold some of my visions were in
Mhm.
2017. And I read the book sometimes and I'm like, wow, I should write that was me. Okay. Yeah, I did. I was
Mm.
thinking that we should do that. And life happens and you get
Yeah.
bogged down by the everyday, by the policy making itself, that you kind of move away from the big visions and the
Big
grandiose sea
ideas.
changes. And to me, I do believe that there's a lot of wisdom in youth. And so I was just, it was almost 10 years ago that I started writing
Mhm.
it. And I'm revisiting some of those ideas today of how could that be implemented? Who do I need to connect
Mm.
to make sure that those pieces are implemented? And as Alana said, we are at a moment of opportunity because
Mhm.
the floor is wide open, right? Like we have so much space to try new things um in 2025, and I think a way that didn't necessarily seem possible yet in 2017.
Mhm. I'm gonna bookmark for a minute. I want to go back. You said something about the movement building purpose of this book, and I want to bookmark that and come back to it.
Okay.
Before we do that, I want to make sure everybody kind of coming to this conversation has a similar grounding because we have a lot of folks coming from the repro movements. We have some folks coming from different places in the LGBTQ movements. I'm going to ask a question of repro and a question of LGBTQ movement kind of terminology or vision. To help ground everybody and help us understand where your sort of book enters the repro movement spaces, can you just explain for folks the different parts of the movement? You referenced reproductive health rights and justice earlier. Can you just kind of give a little background as to what that means so we start from the same place?
Yes, I'll give a little, chicken poppers, little
Mm.
snack. So for me, the reproductive movement, in my book, I write about it as the reproductive rights, reproductive health, and reproductive justice movements coming together to create the repro movement, where reproductive health is really about the provision of care. So it's about your relationship with your provider, your experience going to a pharmacy, talking with a midwife, a doula. So it's all about that provision of care interaction. Whereas reproductive rights is about the right to receive that care, right? And like the rights, the legal policy, where a lot of the work lives for me, particularly as a lawyer, is around the rights to these access these health pieces. So it's about birth control, it's about
Hmm.
all of the things that we're hearing from the Supreme Court. It's about to be, I'm just going to say it's about to be June. Well, it is June. It's
It
Supreme
is
Court.
June.
It's June. It's Supreme Court month. So, expecting some repro cases coming down from the court. Um, and so it's really about the legal pieces, the legal rights. Whereas reproductive justice is a different, more expansive framework, which really looks
Hmm.
at the larger landscape of what is needed to actually access both reproductive rights and beyond that, right? It's about
Hmm.
being able to have a child, not have a child, parent the children that we have in safe and healthy communities, and also sexual freedom and bodily autonomy. And so for me, the reproductive justice movement is this expansive space where you can really see how housing and housing justice and housing rights and needing a safe place to live coincides with having a family, coincides with your ability to access birth control, coincides with the ability to have an address, right? Like it all
Hmm.
interconnects. And so for me, I wrote this book from a reproductive justice space because it's the most expansive space, in my opinion. And it's also the space that was founded by Black feminists and Black womanists. It was started in the early 90s by 12 amazing Black women who wanted to center their experiences and all the things that they needed in order to be able to have children and raise those children. I think maternal health is a big component of reproductive justice. It was beyond the conversation of just not having a child. It was also about
Hmm.
what do we need to have children? And it's still a huge, I mean, that could be a whole separate conversation to talk
We
about.
just had a whole convening about it last week. Yes.
Talk about maternal health and the
Yeah.
needs that are still very present today in 2025. But it was about what do we need to survive and thrive as a community. And so that's where this book starts from. And in the LGBTQ space, it's done through the LGBTQ liberation movement, which I find to be kind of like vis-a-vis along the same vein, parallel as reproductive justice for the LGBTQ space. So in queer movement and work, you have the LGBTQ rights, the LGBTQ health, and the LGBTQ liberation, different movements that all make up the LGBTQ movement, right? So when people are like, what's the queer agenda? I'm like, there's like a lot of happening. Like what, it depends on who you ask. It depends on what lens they're coming from. It depends on what kind of work they're doing. So I just think that's always a very funny question. But for me, LGBTQ liberation is about transforming systems. So it's not just about adding LGBTQ folks into systems that already exist, which is important, right? They're all very important, but how do we transform systems, community, culture in a way that actually works for LGBTQ folks in a way that like maybe some systems may not work. And it's just also a way to explore systems that exist in a like queer fashion that has actually nothing to do with sexual orientation or gender identity, but just a way to look at a system or an institution differently.
Last foundational question before we sort of dive into sort of your vision and some of the real, core points you make in the book. I'm really curious. Maybe I'm the only one very curious about this. So we don't spend lots of time on it, but because you're so rooted in both these places, queer liberation and repro justice, I was interested that you chose like the title, which is like queering repro justice, as opposed to like we could repro queer liberation. Does did that choice mean something to you, and what did you sort of mean by it?
It did mean something to me specifically because when I really first started this work, like deeply doing this work when I was working at the National LGBTQ Task Force, like we did a lot of grappling around, is it queering repro? Are we reproing queer? Like, what are we doing? And it's interesting because I think reproductive justice as a framework already incorporates the LGBTQ experience. And so it really is a book about reproductive justice, right? But like focusing specifically, drawing out the queer perspective and the queer needs. And so queering reproductive justice is a naming of that reality of like what we're centering. It is a reproductive justice book, like first and foremost, but it's about the specific queer experience.
That makes sense. I'm interested. I want to go, we're going to go into some like core kind of points you make in your book. And a lot of it, as you said, we're going to return to how you had a movement building purpose. But there's one really like very grounding area I want to talk about because to me it's so obvious and core to like repro work, but it doesn't always happen in the real world. I feel like over the course of my own career doing both together, there has definitely been an increased attention to acknowledging and addressing the very specific reproductive and sexual health needs of LGBTQ people. Sometimes we didn't think about that at all. And we thought about like, what do white cis women need? And that was repro healthcare. But I feel like there's an increase in acknowledging that. But your book does document a lot of ways that people, and particularly LGBTQ people, do not feel safe or comfortable accessing care, particularly, in certain parts of the kind of reproductive health infrastructure. And I was hoping you might talk about that a little bit more. It's a very obvious kind of intersection. What that problem looks like, and also what's the most important work we should be thinking about to solve that very specific, it is just about the healthcare that people need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a really specific yet larger problem around people feeling safe, right? And a lot of it starts with just education. And so we think of sex ed, right? Like we think when I talk about sex ed, even as a professor, when I start talking about sex ed, it's always about like young people and what does sex mean and all these things. But really sex ed is much bigger than that. And sex ed is also how to teach people how to be more, to move within their world and within their work with more cultural humility. So I've moved away from this piece of cultural competency to cultural humility, cultural competency being this belief that you can become competent in another culture, which I just think is impossible. That's like completely unrealistic, but you can appreciate other culture and you can be humble when you're learning about other culture. But like no one's really going to be fully competent, and even in their own culture, like there's so many different distinctions based on geography and age and just too many different differing factors. And so for me, it's also about education of providers themselves, and from everyone that you interact with at a healthcare facility, right? Like from the person at the reception desk to the nurse to the person who's taking your blood to do your labs to the provider themselves to the person checking you out, like doing all of this education, like that's part of sex education, and that's part of building a safer space. And I don't actually believe in like safe spaces, because we're humans, right? Like everyone has their own, whether people want to admit or recognize it, their own personal biases and personal opinions and beliefs, which are fine. But to me, there's a line that shouldn't be drawn of when it comes into providing holistic, comprehensive healthcare. And so for me, I think part of the answer to your question around this specific issue is about education. And it's also about teaching folks to know what their rights are going in. I mean, I can't even say the amount of times that I worked in the repro movement for so long, and then I was pregnant and I was like, what is happening? Like, what is going on in this appointment? And then I had to do all this personal education about what should be happening between these weeks and weeks of pregnancy, or what should I be expecting postpartum? What should I be expecting through my breastfeeding journey? Like all of these really specific things, and that I just didn't know. And I had to do all this self-education. I think unfortunately our healthcare system is set up where you have to do a lot of self-education. And so coming into your appointments with really specific questions for your provider, because your provider is also, a human. The practitioner you see is a human. And, things change so drastically and so quickly, particularly with law and policy, that sometimes we have to be our own advocates. And so I think that's a way to kind of a mindset of when that is helpful when you're going into these individual conversations and appointments around what are the things that I need to get out of this meeting? What are the things that I need the provider to know about me, or to know about the needs that I have going into the meeting? I think makes it just, I don't know if safer is the right word, but a little bit more efficient. Like a little bit
or
more
maybe less
useful.
maybe less burdensome. I mean, I definitely, it resonates with me. I used to have many friends but also represent people who, like, you know especially trans folks. I worked with people in sort of like different relationship formations. The amount of burden people carry to come in and do that teaching, like in a moment where you're actually trying to, like, to be taken care of.
Right.
To, like, the very purpose of it is to get your needs met. That is like literally the purpose of the transaction. I think I appreciate what you're saying about, like, can we ever make a space totally safe, but can we at least shift the burden a bit on that labor and education that people often have to do in the moment of the healthcare encounter?
I think yes. And, I think we're at a moment of needing to have really creative solutions and innovative solutions to the myriad of problems that we face. And, for one of them, like when it comes to pregnancy and birthing, is doula, right? Like doula
Mhm,
care. But I would love to see doulas be part of the entire pregnancy journey, of like coming with you to your prenatal appointments, having that knowledge,
mhm,
taking some of that burden away from the patient of being like, oh, what am I supposed to ask my provider about what's needed between weeks? I don't,
mhm,
like your third month of pregnancy, like whatever it is, like how are you not everyone's going to know that unless you're just doing a lot of reading and a lot of studying. And then you go to your provider and they're like, oh, we're going to take this test and we're going to do that. And you're like, I don't know what any of that is. But having someone, like having an advocate with you throughout even your pregnancy process or throughout the postpartum process, I feel that we do this really strange thing in US health where there's a lot of attention on pregnancy, there's a lot of attention during birth, but after you're just kind of like left alone. You're like, you know, I
Never
was
again. It's
shocked.
like, see you later.
I was so
Yeah.
shocked to find that you have your 6-week appointment, and then usually like they're like, okay, you're good, and you're like, but that was it. Like I
But
just
I'm falling apart.
I just created this
Yeah.
baby. Like I have the human in the world that I'm trying to care for, and there's like no guidance like at all. Okay. They're like, yeah, we'll just see you at a year for a yearly physical. And you're like, all right. So I think that there's just more that we can do for people postpartum as well. And so those are the kinds of things that I think about in this book of just how to just answer some of these more complicated questions with like really specific solutions.
Yeah, I love that. And I should say for folks who haven't read the book, because I'm about to like move into some more generalized like movement building pieces, the book is just filled of like, if you're like a policy wonk who wants to think about really specific policy ideas, there's like so many things in there throughout Candace's words and also these interviews that Candace has talked about doing with sort of movement leaders. So there's lots of like specific policy ideas. We can come back to some of those, and I am sure in the Q&A that we'll go into some. But I want to zoom out and make sure we spend a bit of time on sort of the kind of the core thesis, and going back to what you said in the first question, that you had a real movement building purpose when you sat down to write this book. And so I have a probably too many multi-part question for you, but I'm going to take them one at a time. I want to explore a little bit more one of your central points that really you argue what we need to be doing is actually bringing more things under the repro justice umbrella. You're saying something more complicated than that, but I'm distilling it to an essence for a second. And as you said, the repro justice umbrella is already pretty broad. It already encompasses like LGBTQ justice in many ways. I agree with that central premise. And but I want to push back about some things I've seen challenging about that in my experience. So I find as we build an intersectional model for justice, it can feel for some folks doing the work, but also those who you want to sort of join the umbrella, it can feel so broad that some people kind of push back or they resist, because not because they're like actually anti the thing, but because it feels so overwhelming to make a tent that is so big. Or it feels strategically ineffective because we've all convinced ourselves if we just fight for this one narrow thing, we can win it. And like the bigger thing is just harder. I think that's real. And on the positive side, I do think it can be building sort of intersectional movement can be a really important strategy for building a larger movement that actually solves root causes of problems. But I feel like we sometimes don't grapple with that tension, that like it's hard for people to enter and hold a lot or be strategic. So I have a couple questions for you in this vein. The first one is, can you talk a little bit about what you think is like the unifying thing at the core of reproductive justice that you think sort of should or does link us all together, or the concept that sort of links us, at least, across that LGBTQ intersection you're trying to focus on? And frankly, to me, one thing that's always interesting is like, and then who decides that? Who decides what that core thing that brings us together is? And I'll just say, I alluded to this in my earlier comments, I've often thought about it being sort of this wider gender justice vision that can tackle sort of underlying stereotypes about men and women and what's a family and what's the role of intimate relationships and sex and, historical discrimination that actually really holds us all back. It's the same thing that fuels the anti-trans movement, underlying bias against people in same gender relationships. It limits reproductive justice because like the role of women is to go mother and be at home, and that's what we should do. But that's just my view of the thing. Maybe it's something else. What do you think?
Yeah, so I will try to remember all of the parts of all.
Okay, well, yeah, that was just the first part. That was a lot of words. Sorry, Candace.
So I guess let me start with the tent question of the expansiveness of reproductive justice. I think that it was purposeful to be so expansive, and it's difficult. Like, it is. It's difficult to be expansive all the time. And I also don't think reproductive justice asks us to be expansive all the time. I think
Mhm.
instead it's asking us to work together for a larger vision, right? And so
Mhm.
yes, find your spot. Like, find, the old saying, like, get in where you fit in. Like, find the
Mhm.
piece that makes the most sense for you, that you enjoy working in, the issue area that you're passionate about, the type of work, whether it's law, policy, organizing, communications, like whatever it is, like, use your passions and your gifts towards this larger focus of achieving reproductive justice. And so for me, I think it was intentional. It's
Mhm.
supposed to be a big tent for a reason, because we have big tent problems, right? Like, we don't have
Yeah.
just like one solving for one of the, like, I'm just going to make up a number. One of the 50
Mhm.
issues is not going to get us to reproductive justice or reproductive liberation, but it will help along the way. But if everyone
Mhm.
in the movement is just focused on that one issue, not only do we not achieve those other issues, but also we lose focus, and
Mhm.
those other issues all slide back, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's always a push and pull to all of these different pieces. So we need to create networks. It's about like that movement building, organizing mentality of like creating the networks. So that these groups and these folks over here have their eyes on climate change. That these folks and these groups have their eyes on education. Like, we need to know that, and we need to work together and call these big tent
Mhm.
conversations where we really talk about what is the larger strategy going forward. Um,
Mhm.
and I think some of the big ideas that we're thinking about, like bodily autonomy, right? So I think that has to be a part of the larger ideal, but also family building. And so one of the pieces of that I talk about in my book is like, maybe we should redefine what family means, right? Like, family has been very specific within a Western US context, right? Of like, who makes a family, what does it look like, what are the roles in the family? And it's like,
Mhm.
feminists for a long time have really looked at that and grappled with that. And what is the alternative, right? Like, there haven't been a lot of alternatives named.
Mhm.
And so I think what happens a lot of time as an academic, I will say this as an academic, like, there's a lot of critique, but there's not a lot of solutions.
Mm.
Like, it's really easy to critique a system that exists. It's really hard to create a system. It's really hard to create the thing that is coming next. And
Mhm.
so for me, the LGBTQ liberation pieces of transformation is like, what is family?
Mhm.
And maybe there are other words that we need to describe what it is that we're trying to get to, because I talk about families of one, right? Like, what does that mean to be a family of one, or to be a
Mhm.
single parent with one child? Like, that is a family, right? And so to me, it's not just about this naming and cultural pieces, it's also about the legality, right? Like, the policy
Mhm.
pieces of like, family means something in the law. Like, marriage means something really specific. It comes with rights and privileges that single personhood does not, right? And so the relationships are not just about culture and how we define things and what are the roles. It's
Mhm.
also about like, what are the laws that protect certain institutions and grant privileges and rights that are associated with
Mm.
them. So like, they're all interconnected. Like, you can't just talk about family building without talking about law and policy.
Mhm. I love that. I wish we had like 40 more minutes because I want to talk about that specific
Yeah, yeah.
idea. I was having like that's one area. Well, okay, I'm gonna stop myself from going off on that tangent. I'm like down the road if people are interested, that's actually something interesting in the family, in like the family leave and sick leave movement. That's
Yeah.
actually one place where I think the repro movement tried to make some inroads to actually be more thoughtful about how you define who is family you get to take leave for. But a lot of times it comes from a like, we want to do that because we don't want to exclude anyone. And that's good. That's better than excluding people. But it's not always coming from the like, it's because we're rowing to this wider idea or different idea of family. I don't know, it's interesting. We'll bookmark that. I want to know from a very practical perspective, what do you think we kind of gain and what do we lose when we have the more connected and intersecting vision? And maybe to you, we don't lose anything. I'm thinking of the people who critique like it's hard, but as you've already said, you're not saying everybody has to work on the same thing or everybody has to do the same thing. So curious what you think. What's gained and what's lost
I
in sort
think
of
what
that bigger tent?
I think what's gained is a collective vision, right? And
Hmm.
a collective sense of where you're all moving towards. Like movement building, like movement. Like we have to move somewhere, right? It's not like sitting building, like it's not staying in the same place building. Like we're moving towards something different.
Hmm.
And so to me, I'm part of me, I'm like, I should have been studied linguistics because language is really important, right? Like talking about
Hmm.
movement building, like we're building towards something and we're going in a certain direction. And it's important to
Hmm.
know what that direction is. I still think that there's a lot of question about what is that direction that we're actually moving it towards and
Hmm.
that still needs to be grappled with. And so I think that's a huge issue because it's
Hmm.
hard. It's really hard.
I know.
It's really hard work. Like envisioning, visioning, creating worlds and out of nothing is really difficult work. It's easy to just, figure out like, oh, I want this too, or I want to do that, or okay, let's look
Hmm.
at that model, even like in that country. Let's look at that model and study it from an international space. But to create something that's never existed before is hard. And it's
Mm.
hard to bring people with you along that vision because it takes a certain type of ability to abstract think in a interesting way. I am not at all like a math person. So if somebody was like, okay, we're gonna solve the equation through this math I would be like, what? Like, that's just not how my brain works. So part of it is like figuring out how do we get to a message that actually makes sense to people of where we're going and how their role matters in
Hmm.
getting there, right? Like I think part of movement building is like, oh, I have to be in charge of this whole space. Like I have to do all of this. I have to hold all this down. And part of it is like, no, it's like, can you pick up the phone and call your representative a couple times a year, right? Like it's not
Hmm.
as big all the time as I think we make it. And it's, I think there's, because of just how the social justice nonprofit world works, like I think it kind of like challenges what, an entry point, like of how people can
Hmm.
enter the work. I feel like volunteerism needs to come back, right?
Mm.
Like
It's
I
a great
think that
point.
that's been lost. Um, in a way, like I'm not saying people don't volunteer. People do volunteer, but like
Hmm.
how do people enter the movement, right? Like
Yeah.
without it being their full-time job
Full-time job.
or it's like a substantial amount of time. Like how do people just say I'm really interested in reproductive justice. I'm really interested in LGBTQ liberation. I want to be a part of these conversations. How can I do that?
Hmm.
And how do I learn to join these movements? Like what can I do to contribute? And I think it's hard. It's hard if you're interested in an issue of like how do you jump
Hmm.
in? And so
Yeah.
I think for folks who work in these spaces, like it's on us to think of how to bring more people into the tent. Like sometimes we
Hmm.
just get so bogged down by the day to day and like the policies of the moment and fighting back against them or promoting them that we forget that there's like all these people over here who are like, I want to help. I want to help. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legislator. I'm not like, I don't know it. But I can make calls. Like
Right.
an event planner and I can do a fundraiser, like there's a million things that we can do to bring more people into this work. And I think that's part of
Hmm.
the work that needs to happen like
Yeah.
within organizational spaces.
I have only two additional quick questions before I want to make sure we open. There are some questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure we give some time for that. But you gave some really concrete examples, like the opening up volunteerism more, promoting that more. I think you used a good example, you know, kind of shifting the mindset that like being intersectional and having a big tent means you do everything and everything. Like it could just mean like you sometimes make calls about immigrant rights or, X issue. I'm just using that as an example. Um, are there other things you think sort of in the immediate term the movements could do to start like baby step building toward thinking about having more of that shared vision, not being as reactive, starting to think together? Are there other steps that you've thought about or you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, well, as a think tank that you sit in, that you lead, I mean, I think part of it is like thinking about how we do this, right? Like it's about how, like naming, taking the time, like it's a privilege to think, right? Like it's a privilege to
Mhm.
be in a room with experts to think about how can we make X, Y, or Z more accessible to the public. But I also think it's about creating networks within our networks, right? Like I think there's such a divide between federal work and state work and grassroots organization. And there isn't an organization or like group that has really brought everyone together under the tent, right? Like we're
Mhm.
still kind of like out in our own silos, kind of like wandering in the same like universal wilderness, but like no
Mhm.
one's been like this way, like, like
Right.
we're
As
going
all
this
of our institutions like burn down and crumble.
right. Like we're all like in the same like
Yeah.
desert, kind of like wandering around, but like no one's like the water's over there, like no one's like naming that. Um, and so to me, I'm just like, we have to do it, right? Like
Mhm.
we have to step up. Like sometimes it takes us, like we are who we are waiting for. Like that is, we are not, there is no like charismatic leader coming to save us. There just isn't. There just isn't. And so part of it is creating the hard things and like
Mhm.
being okay with being wrong. Like people are going to make a lot of mistakes. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be cute. It's a lot of times not going to even be fun, but it's important and it's going to get us to where we need to go. So part of it I think is figuring out like how to do the big tent conversations and what that looks like, and having organizational leads really come together to name, I worked at the ACLU as well. And so it's like the
Mhm.
intersectional folks who are doing work from all of these different areas, like seeing the through line around
Mhm.
bodily autonomy and privacy and also government intervention and how do all of these things work together. And it's like it's
Mhm.
academic, but it's practical, it's policy, it's legislative, like it's all of these things um in a really intersectional way that's really difficult to do,
Yeah.
but it's the hard work that we have to do for
Mhm.
our generation and the future generations. Like if we're not going to do this work, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
And actually the opposite is going to happen. Things are just going to continually be rolled back if we're not paying attention to them.
Mhm. I wholeheartedly agree, and I think so much, and I'm picking on myself here in my own career. I mean, I think so much of it is just getting people to the place of seeing, the attack over here being connected to me, right? The
Yep.
attack over here being connected to me, and that we're not always there yet. And I think that's what a lot of the move, the work is. Last question before we tie,
Yes.
because I would like, you do have a positive forward looking vision. um I guess I'll ask it this way. Is there any upside that you see to sort of this current moment of crisis and crumbling that our country is in, or something making you, feel hopeful in this moment, to build toward what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we have nothing but opportunity, right? Like the floor is open, the sky's open, like the sky is the limit, like it's not the limit. Limits do not exist.
Mhm.
Um, I just think that we have an opportunity sometimes when you're left with nothing, you have to create something, right? Like you have to create it for something to exist. And so you have to be visionary. Like we don't have the option to not be visionary. The older ways of doing things, while some of them are valid, I'm not saying throw everything away. Like some things have continually worked for hundreds and hundreds of years. Like, yes, keep those. But some of the things, like more specific things, like you maybe move on from that tactic or that tool, put that tool away from the toolbox, like like we don't need to save everything. We don't need to save every tactic. We don't need to be, faxing things because like we don't need that technology anymore. Like, and so sometimes letting go, like the process of letting go of even ways of that I've worked for the last 15 years and being like, I got really good at it and we're here. So like maybe that's not the
Resonates.
best tactic. And maybe it's time to like let that strategy go and instead create some space to do some thinking about what's new. And it's also like bringing new people into the conversation, right? Like I think again, like young people have so much to teach everyone about the world and I love hearing from my students. They teach me as much as I teach them because I'm like, oh, okay, this is how you're communicating. Oh, this is what you're thinking. Oh, how interesting. And then you can kind of have this, I think it has to be multi-generational. We're not going to get there, right? Like I'm a millennial and I mean, how many recessions have we been through? Like, I don't know. That's just like millennial experience. Like, oh, that's another recession. And so each generation has their own like experiences that I think are going to be really useful as we're thinking about what's next. And I also like to think really broadly and really sweepingly about like not what's next in the next 4 years and the next 5 minutes, but like what does the next 100 years look like? Like how can you plan for 100 years from now, knowing that you will not be there? Like how can you plan for that? And what is the leadership pipeline that you're creating that's going to be leading that and planning for that? So I like to think like generationally ahead of where I am. Like I have kids, like I'm thinking about them. I'm thinking about, if they choose to have kids of their own, like that's how you create community. And reproductive justice, I think, and queering reproductive justice, to bring it all the way back, is really about this legacy creating. And it's like legacy and futuristic thinking of how can we make sure that our communities really, really do survive and thrive. I know that's like become a talking point, but it's a reality. Like it's something that we're still reaching forward for. And I think that it's something we can actually achieve.
I love that. Thank you for leaving on that note. Not leaving the conversation because we have some questions. But I want to, Alana, I'm going to invite you to come back and lead us through some questions. But I really just want to appreciate you and your thoughts and your wisdom that created this wonderful book. So thank you, Candace. But Alana, I'm going to turn it to you.
I know that last answer was really actually quite uplifting. And I'm going to bring us back in the weeds with a tough question right now that I think is a good, really great one, because I feel like I encounter this a lot in our work as well. And the question is, what do you say to folks who are hesitant about linking reproductive health care with transgender health care? Or like, because trans health is under attack, they may express hesitation because they could fear that the attacks on trans healthcare could burden repro, or vice versa. Love to hear your thoughts on that one.
That's an interesting question. And I don't believe in siloing experience. So to me, like trans health is reproductive health, and siloing the experience because one may be under attack, but the other one's not under attack. Like they're both under attack. Like if trans rights are under attack, then repro rights are under attack. I don't think there's a way to say it any other way, like, or a way to look at it. And so for me, it's like, yeah, you band together, like you stand together and you keep fighting for those folks who are experiencing in their daily lives today are, trans folks trying to get reproductive health care. So I think that you don't silo them. Like you keep them intersectional and you keep the intersectional fight. And like at all different parts of our lives, you know, we're all intersectional beings, and some parts are maybe not be under attack, but like may experience more difficulties than other parts of our lives. And that's just like human experience. And so like I don't want to take out the humanness from the movements that we're working in and that we're creating.
Yeah. Can I add one thing on a more law and policy thing? Because this, I think about this a lot too. I feel like, Candace, you gave like a very great, like human, we cannot be delinked answer. I think also practically, I don't think people, the folks who are sort of like, oh, but that's less popular, that's harder. Like, one, I don't even think that's true. But two, we're like, they're linked in a way we can't control anyway, because actually like the law and policy and like the legal levers that and principles or constitutional rights that surround both are the same.
Yeah.
And so we actually can't think about them separately, because a diminishing in one area will absolutely, without any question, impact the other. So very practically, it's also strategically not a great idea to try to delink them.
Thank you both. Another question that I think I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on, and I think does get us back to that kind of global and visionary posture. The question is, does your book talk on the does your book touch on the connections between regional and global movements? And could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can speak to that quickly because it is not. So this, as reproductive justice and LGBTQ liberation are super expansive, I intentionally focused on the US and particularly, even more specifically, federal policy, recognizing that each state and region and local policy making looks different, right? And so I was really specific and intentional in that choice. But also the global aspect, I think that whatever the US does is global, right? Like it's the US, it's in such there's a lot there. They're in such an interesting position, particularly right now in the global stage. So coming to it from that perspective, yes, but I also invite people in the book, it's called Queering Reproductive Justice: An Invitation, to do some of that research, to do some of that writing, to do some of that linking, because I do think there are really important global aspects of this work and of this book. And it was an intentional choice for me to focus on US federal policy.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question. I think we have enough time for one more.
Okay.
And this one, our audience member asks mentions that Maryland just enacted a new law that creates public health abortion grant program and fund, which leverages some state government funding to provide abortion for people who have barriers to care. And I was curious if what you think about that kind of model, and some pros and cons of that, or maybe just pros, if you have thoughts on that kind of innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would have to look at it, to be honest. The lawyer in me is like, I would need to review before I could say what my actual pros and cons are on this specific law. But and aside, I think that pretty much all innovations that ensure and enable access to care, to reproductive health care, are generally good, right? But again, I would have to look specifically at the law and like the language of the law to say specifically like what I think the pros and cons are.
Thank you very much. I think that's the time. I really appreciate the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for joining this conversation with us, Candace. Thank you for writing this book. And I hope everyone goes off and reads it. And thank you for
Yes,
inviting me
yes,
to be in
please.
conversation.
Yeah, please read it. Please keep queer and reproductive justice out there, and like keep challenging folks around how to bring people into the movement, I think is an important piece of work that we all can do. Yeah, and just, stay safe, stay hydrated, take your vitamins, and, we continue to move on.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined us.
Thank you.
Take care.